The monitors beeped in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to heartbreak, and in the pristine white halls of Manhattan's most expensive private hospital, a man who owned half the skyline stood utterly powerless, staring through glass at the tiny chest of his 3-month-old daughter rising and falling with mechanical assistance, while somewhere 17 blocks away, a 12-year-old boy named Marcus was collecting cans in the rain, unaware that his life and the billionaires were about to collide in a way that would rewrite everything both of them believed about the world. Richard Ashford had built empires, turned failing companies into gold, commanded boardrooms with a single glance. But none of that mattered now, as he pressed his palm against the window of the NICU. His reflection ghostly and desperate, his wife Catherine collapsed in the chair behind him. Her designer clothes rumpled from 3 sleepless days, her eyes red and swollen, her hands clutching a pink blanket that still smelled like the lavender soap they'd used during the one precious week their daughter. Lily had been home before the seizures started, before the specialists flew in from Switzerland and Japan and Johns Hopkins, before 15 of the world's most renowned pediatric doctors stood in a conference room and delivered the words that shattered their universe. "We've exhausted every option, Mr. Ashford. Her condition is deteriorating, and we don't have an answer." The diagnosis was a genetic disorder, so rare it didn't even have a proper name. A mutation that caused her body to reject essential proteins, shutting down her organs, one by one. And the only theoretical treatment involved a bone marrow transplant from a donor with an almost impossible genetic match. A match that required not just compatible blood type, but a specific genetic marker found in less than 1 in 5 million people. A marker the National Registry didn't have. A marker that international databases couldn't locate. A marker that might not even exist in another living human being, or so they thought. Richard had offered $10 million to anyone who could save his daughter. Then 20, then 50, the number climbing as desperation took hold. But money meant nothing when science had no solution. And as he stood there watching his baby girl's tiny fingers curl and uncurl in unconscious reflex, he felt the crushing weight of his own insignificance, all his wealth and power reduced to nothing but paper and illusion. While Catherine whispered prayers she wasn't sure she believed in, bargaining with a God she'd ignored for most of her adult life, promising to be better, to give everything away, to dedicate her life to helping others, if only, please, if only their daughter could live. Marcus knew nothing of penthouses, or private hospitals, or the kind of desperation that came with having everything except the one thing that mattered. His world was measured in subway tokens and dollar store dinners, in the weight of aluminum cans, in a trash bag slung over his shoulder, in the careful mathematics of survival that he'd learned since his mother got sick 2 years ago. The cancer that had taken her hair, and then her strength, and then her job, leaving 12-year-old Marcus as the man of their tiny 2-room apartment in the Bronx, caring for his younger sister Imani, while their mother underwent treatments at the free clinic. Treatments that were working but slowly, leaving them suspended, in a state of perpetual exhaustion and hope. Marcus had learned to be invisible in the way that poor kids in rich neighborhoods learn, slipping through the streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side in the early mornings, collecting recyclables from the bins of buildings where a single apartment cost more than his family would see in 10 lifetimes. And he'd learned not to make eye contact, not to expect kindness, having been shooed away and called names, and made to feel like his poverty was a personal failing, a stain that offended the manicured world around him. But he'd also learned resilience, and joy in small things, and a fierce protective love for his mother and sister that made every early morning and every heavy bag worth it. On the 4th day of Lily's decline, when the doctors had begun using words like ours, and prepare yourselves, Marcus was making his usual rounds near the hospital, not because he knew what was happening inside, but because the medical buildings always had good recycling. And he was reaching into a bin outside the main entrance when he heard the sound of breaking glass and a man's anguished cry. Looking up to see a tall figure in an expensive suit standing in a 3rd-floor window, his fist against the glass, his body radiating a grief so profound it seemed to bend the air around him, and Marcus stood there, frozen, trash bag in hand, witnessing a pain that transcended wealth or status. Recognizing it because he'd felt its echo when his mother first got diagnosed. That specific terror of losing someone you'd die to protect. Something made Marcus walk into that hospital instead of continuing his route, some pull he couldn't name, his feet carrying him past the gleaming lobby where a security guard called after him but didn't chase, into an elevator where a tired nurse was too exhausted to question his presence, and up to the 3rd floor, where he wandered until he found the NICU wing, watching through windows at babies in incubators, at parents with hollow eyes, at a world of suffering that money apparently couldn't fix. And he was about to leave, feeling foolish and out of place in his damp jacket and worn sneakers, when he saw the man from the window sitting on the floor in an empty hallway, his head in his hands, this powerful-looking person, completely broken. And Marcus did something that would change everything. He sat down next to him. Richard didn't look up at first, assuming it was another doctor or nurse, but then he registered the silence, the lack of clinical sympathy, and he turned to see a skinny black kid in clothes 2 sizes too big, sitting cross-legged against the wall, not speaking, just present, and his first instinct was to ask who the boy was and why he was there. But something in the moment stopped him, some desperate need for company that didn't come with medical degrees and apologetic expressions. And so the two of them sat in silence for what might have been 5 minutes, or 20, until Richard finally spoke, his voice raw. "My daughter is dying, and I can't do anything to stop it." And Marcus, who understood powerlessness in ways this rich man was only now discovering, said quietly, "I'm sorry. That's really hard." And there was something in the simplicity of those words, the lack of platitudes or solutions, that made Richard start talking, spilling everything to this stranger child, the diagnosis, the impossible genetic marker, the uselessness of his wealth, the unbearable thought of a world without his daughter's eyes opening again. And Marcus listened the way he'd learned to listen to his mother on her hard days, with his whole heart. Without trying to fix, just bearing witness. When Richard finally stopped talking, drained and oddly lighter, he asked Marcus why he was there, and the boy explained about the cans, about his mother, about doing what needed to be done. And Richard felt something crack open in his chest, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time how narrow his world had been, how insulated, how he'd built walls of wealth that separated him from the truth of how most people lived, how much courage it took to survive without safety nets, how this child possessed a strength he'd never had to develop. And in that moment of recognition, Marcus said something that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his 12 years. "When my mom got sick, the doctors at the free clinic said she needed this special medicine we couldn't afford. And I was so scared because I thought only money could save her. But then this medical student, he was doing research and needed patients for a trial, and my mom qualified, and she got the treatment free, and it worked. And I learned that sometimes the answer comes from places you don't expect, from people who aren't even looking for you, but who are looking for the same thing you need. And maybe that's what hope is, you know? Just staying alive long enough for the unexpected thing to find you." Richard stared at this boy, at this young philosopher in a wet jacket, and something sparked in his exhausted mind, a connection he'd been too overwhelmed to make. And he pulled out his phone with shaking hands, calling Dr. Reeves, the lead geneticist, asking a question he should have thought of days ago. "Are there any current studies on protein rejection disorders? Any trials? Any research happening anywhere that might not be focused on treatment but on understanding the genetic mechanism?" And there was silence on the other end, then typing, then a sharp intake of breath as Dr. Reeves said, "There's a graduate student at Columbia. Her dissertation is on genetic markers in rare protein disorders. She's been building a private database of volunteers for genetic mapping. It's not official. It's not in the registry, because her study isn't complete. But," and Richard was already standing, already pulling Marcus up with him, saying, "Call her, now. Offer her anything, everything. Full funding for her research, a lab, whatever she needs. Just get her database cross-referenced with Lily's markers in the next hour." What happened next moved with the speed of desperation meeting opportunity. The graduate student, a young woman named Priya, who'd been working 2 jobs to fund her research, brought her laptop to the hospital at 2 in the morning, running algorithms while Richard paced and Catherine emerged from Lily's room like a ghost, and Marcus sat in the corner, still there, because no one had thought to send him away, and because he needed to know how the story ended. And at 3:47 a.m., Priya looked up from her screen with tears streaming down her face and said, "I have a match, a 97% compatibility, a volunteer from my study, a woman in Newark who participated 6 months ago," and the room erupted into controlled chaos. Phones ringing, helicopter blades spinning to life on the hospital roof, surgical teams assembling, and Richard grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and said, "You saved her. You saved my daughter." But Marcus shook his head and said, "I just sat with you. You saved her by asking a different question." And Catherine, who had been watching this boy who'd appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers, knelt down to his eye level and asked, "What's your name, sweetheart? And does your mother know where you are?" The surgery happened as dawn broke over Manhattan, Lily receiving the bone marrow transplant that her body accepted with what the doctors called remarkable compatibility, her organs beginning to stabilize hour by hour. And while they waited for confirmation that the treatment was working, Richard and Catherine learned everything about Marcus, about his mother undergoing cancer treatment, about 9-year-old Emma, about the apartment in the Bronx and the early morning can collecting, and the kind of poverty that Richard had known existed but never really seen. And something fundamental shifted in both of them, a reordering of values that happened not through philosophy, but through the undeniable reality of this child, who'd shown up at their darkest moment and offered the gift of simple presence, who'd shared wisdom earned through his own suffering, who'd catalyzed the chain of thought that led to their daughter's salvation, and who asked for nothing in return. When Lily's numbers came back strong on the 2nd day post-transplant, when the doctors used words like hopeful and recovery and she's going to make it, Richard made a series of phone calls that would reshape his family's legacy. He established a foundation dedicated to rare disease research with an initial funding of $200 million, with Priya as the director and a mandate to make genetic screening accessible to underserved communities. He created a scholarship fund for kids like Marcus, not based on grades, but on demonstrated resilience and heart. He hired Marcus's mother, once she was strong enough, to help run the foundation's community outreach, recognizing that she understood the communities they needed to serve in ways he never could. And he set up a trust for Marcus and Amani's education and his mother's ongoing medical care, not as charity, but as recognition of a debt that couldn't be measured in money, a life returned through an act of simple human kindness. Marcus's mother, Maria, cried when she met Catherine in the hospital cafeteria. 2 mothers who'd walked through the valley of potentially losing everything, and they held each other with the understanding of shared terror and shared grace. And Maria said, "Marcus has always had an old soul, even when he was little, always finding people who needed comfort." And Catherine replied, "He gave us more than comfort. He gave us perspective when we were drowning. He reminded us that solutions come from connection, not just consumption." And in that moment, a friendship formed that would last the rest of their lives, bridging worlds that society said should remain separate, proving that crisis could be a doorway to genuine human communion. 6 months later, Lily was thriving, a healthy, laughing baby with bright eyes and a future that stretched out like a gift. And the Ashfords had moved out of their isolated penthouse into a neighborhood with actual community, sending their wealth to work in ways that created opportunity rather than just accumulating more. And Marcus, who still collected cans sometimes because the habit of contribution was too deep to break, now did it with his new friends from the private school where he'd received a full scholarship, teaching them about parts of the city they'd never seen, building bridges with every conversation. And when people asked him about the day he saved the billionaire's baby, he always corrected them, saying, "I didn't save anybody. I just remembered that we're all human. We all hurt the same. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit with someone in their pain and remind them they're not alone. Because connection is the thing that saves us. Every single time, not money or power or even medicine, but the moment when we look at each other and recognize that we're the same, that we matter to each other, that we're all just trying to protect the people we love and make it through the hard days with some grace and maybe some hope that tomorrow will be gentler." On Lily's first birthday, Richard and Catherine hosted a celebration that mixed their old world and their new one. Corporate executives mingling with community organizers, doctors talking with patients, wealth meeting need in a space of genuine festivity. And when Richard gave a toast, he looked directly at Marcus and said, "A year ago, I thought power meant control. I thought success meant insulation from difficulty. I thought I could buy solutions to any problem. And then I met a 12-year-old boy who taught me that wisdom doesn't correlate with wealth. That courage looks like a kid taking care of his family with nothing but determination. That the answer to my desperate prayer came not from my world but from someone I might have walked past without seeing. And I learned that we save each other, not through grand gestures, but through showing up, through asking better questions, through recognizing our shared humanity. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the lesson my daughter's survival taught me, that we are all connected, that everyone has value, and that the measure of a life well lived is not what you accumulate, but what you give and who you become through the giving." And there wasn't a dry eye in the room as Marcus, now 13 and still shy of attention, hugged Lily and whispered to her, "You're going to do amazing things, little one. You're going to remember that your life is a gift that came from a lot of people caring, and you're going to pass that on." And in that moment, everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just a birthday party but a testament to transformation. Proof that crisis could break you open in ways that let the light in. That the unthinkable thing wasn't what Marcus had done but what he'd been, simply, courageously, beautifully himself. A poor kid who sat down next to a suffering stranger and offered the revolutionary gift of compassionate presence, reminding all of them that the things that save us aren't bought or earned, but shared, heart to heart, in the terrifying and magnificent moments when we let ourselves be truly seen.